Hello, Christchurch, and welcome to this edition of Deeper. And it's a pleasure to have John Sexton here today. John spoke on Sunday, and I would encourage you to watch it because John was as good as he always is. John, welcome to Deeper.
Thank
Good
you,
to have
and
you.
that's very kind of you. And sometimes I think when you only have a few days to prepare, sometimes it's fresher than when you've got a month to prepare it.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think it was a bit uncanny because it followed on to the verse from where you left off the previous Sunday.
That's right.
And only probably a week or two later in the narrative of the Exodus story.
Yeah, possibly. So we're going to have a little bit of a look at this passage. The passage, I suggest that you read Exodus 16 verses 1 to 20 all the way through. We actually missed out a little bit in the middle on Sunday, but why not read the whole bit, because the missing bit is interesting. So why don't you do that now? If you press pause, read the passage, Exodus 16, 1 to 20, and then restart the video when you've finished. Fantastic. So John, you said it's probably a week or so after the previous story. I think I read elsewhere that this is perhaps about a month after they left Egypt. So, and what do we find? That they're grumbling again, aren't they, John?
Yeah, it's it's in their nature, but anyone who's been in any sort of middle management position or any person who is perhaps in church leadership or in politics feels they get more grumbling from underneath than they deserve. But also the people doing the grumbling often feel that they have perfectly valid points that they just don't know why nobody listens to them all the time as well.
That's right. And so they're crossing the desert of sin, and I don't think we're to take that necessarily as sin as in sinful lifestyle. This is sin as in a place, and they're getting hungry. And of course, that is always going to bring out the worst of people. I don't know about you, John, but I do get hangry. If I'm hungry, I'm angry. And so we can imagine them coming out of Egypt with sacks of food. But by now, maybe it's running a little bit thin. They've been rationing maybe for a little while. It's getting a little bit harder. And they start grumbling. And of course, you made a great point in your talk that we see in verse 3, that they kind of selectively remember what life was like in Egypt.
Yes. Those of the church who are old enough to remember Joseph will remember there's a great scene where all the brothers become French for 5 minutes and remember the good days in Canaan and the fields were gloriously gold and they had everything they wanted. And there may well have been a bit of that, but I think sometimes our memories of things are a bit rosy coloured when we want them to be, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, they are forgetting the years and years and years of hard labor that they'd suffered under the Egyptians. And they could have been fed well. There's no reason why they couldn't have been, but they were slaves and they worked hard.
And they need to take, I think, a little personal responsibility here as well, because they'd cried out to God to be delivered from this, and he was delivering them. So they were only actually he was only actually doing what they begged him to do.
That's right. And of course, God had a bigger purpose for Israel, didn't he? So even if they hadn't been in slavery and they were fed well, that was still not God's purpose for them. They were to be a nation on their own. They were to be a people who had their own land, that were free. That was God's purpose. And God was simply calling them back to the purpose that he had given them back with Abraham.
That's right, because everybody, and this message of all Christian social teaching, isn't it, that everyone, we can't just say that people are a different country or a different nationality or different to ourselves in some way. Everyone has a right to a certain level of dignity under God's dominion and justice. But also there's something else going on here as well. It's not just God's purpose to deliver the Israelites. I think some of the reasons he's so tough with them is that view is a little narrow. It's also part of a story that will take 2,000 years to come to fruition, of delivering salvation for the whole world by taking a people and making himself known to them and gradually putting layer of revelation of himself on them until ultimately Jesus comes.
Absolutely.
And they are pivotal to that whole story.
Yeah, they are. And then God hears their cry, and in verse 4 we see God respond to that. Lord says to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven. And that's a lovely little phrase, isn't it? Because usually in the Bible, that idea of rain implies abundance. And of course, that's what they seem to have here, that, you know, they would have an abundance of bread. And he even instructs them to have a day of rest. I mean, this is God at his most gracious, isn't it? Here are the people of Israel moaning and grumbling, and he decides to simply give them bread, not for them to work for it, but to give it to them. And on top of that, factors in the Sabbath and the day of rest, which I think is gloriously gracious.
It is, because we all need a break from time to time from them. They have a long time ahead of them, their actions subsequently. I think if you're doing long distance footpaths, I did a lot of that when I was younger. When we're in a group or when you're on your own, every 4 or 5 or 6 days or once a week, you just have a day when you're not walking, because that will recharge you for the following week. That's
right. And then in this verse, there's a little line where God says that in this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. And I love the way you described that phrase test on Sunday. Do you want to just expand on that a little bit more?
All right. Well, when I was teaching in the university, there's 2 sorts of assessment in academic theory. One is summative, which is pass or fail, and that's the end of it. Although actually these days you get 2 resit attempts as well. But generally it's summative. And then there's the sort that they do in all those classic movies like Dirty Dancing, or what's the one with the little boy who has to learn kung fu?
Karate Kid.
Yes, but each test, or even if you're a Jedi, you're eventually ready to be sent out when you can defeat your master, or all those Robin Hood films, you know. So it's like that sort of test. You pick yourself up until one day they say, right, you're ready to move on. You've learned something here, and each time you learn something, it's formative. And also the feedback is as much looking back on why it went well or went wrong is important as well. You know, how can I reflect and improve my performance next time?
Yeah, exactly. And of course,
the Israelites
go on.
I was going to say the Israelites are not very good at reflecting. This sort of little story comes up again and again throughout the Exodus story, and again throughout their whole history. And perhaps they are an example of ourselves as well. And they're not terribly good at, if they learn from their mistakes, they're not very good at keeping that memory in mind for very long.
Not at all.
Yeah, I was once in a cell group 20 years ago, and the poor lady's probably dead now, but she was very inspiring. I remember her saying at one point, she hesitates to pray for dependence on God and trust in God, because every time she does, something terrible happens in her life.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But it is true. Those people who've reached a ripe old age and are strong in their faith have gone through a lot, and looking back on it, can remember that God sustained them through it. And that the one thing they didn't forget at any time was that God didn't bring them out into this time or into the desert for the Israelites to die, did he? Or to take them through it.
Exactly, yeah. And in some ways, that's the accusation of the people of Israel to Moses, isn't it? We see that in verse 3. They kind of accuse Moses, like, you brought us out here simply to starve to death. And
well, again, it's taking responsibility thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because as Rob said last week, they could have gone the short way across. The top is perhaps a third the distance, and in spite of the sea the whole time. But of course, it would have taken them through some very fierce tribes and nations. So again, you have to take some responsibility for the consequences of your decisions. What did interest me though is when the whole community grumbled, and grumbling or communal anger is very contagious. It brings out the worst. How many people it would have taken within that crowd of Israelites just to say, well, hold on, don't you remember all the things that God's done for us? And I don't think it would have taken many. Jesus talks about Christians being the salt of the earth or the leaven in the bread, just to convince a few people around them, just to calm down. But it's very hard when your children are screaming for food, isn't it?
It is. And then we get into verses 5 to 10, which we missed out on Sunday. But this is a whole passage about the people grumbling. What do you see in that little passage there, John?
Well, it was interesting that Moses and Aaron said that you need to remember, when you're grumbling against us, you're actually grumbling against God. And I suppose that's a perfectly reasonable observation from Moses to make, given that they know and he knows that every step they've done has been at God's instruction. But sometimes it's easy to take our frustrations out on the people nearest to us. So workers do it to middle managers. church members do it to church leaders. The public do it to their politicians. In a way, none of which is helpful. Rather than just but that's not to be confused with legitimate grievances. There's a time for speaking out, but there's also a time for recognizing that. Well, I suppose the question is, what's God's will? It all comes back to that. What's God's will? When your speaking out should be determined not by your own pain or disgruntlement, but by God's heart, and that's perhaps a harder call to make.
It is, and probably in the end, when we're going through difficult times, sometimes our need for comfort overrides our need to follow the will of God, and that's when grumbling starts to come in. When we can keep the bigger picture, like Moses had to, where we can see that this is more than simply my short-term lack of pain, difficulty, or struggle, then we can kind of work through it a lot better if we see the bigger picture. Unfortunately, the Israelites didn't.
But I'm also conscious, and you as a vicar sees it much more intimately with so many more people, that everyone goes through times in their life when desperately sad or wicked things have happened to them, and they're left crying out, why? Where are you, God, in this time?
And then we move on to verses 11 onwards. And so God promises them not just bread, but meat, which is fantastic, isn't it? And we see just God's incredible provision here, don't we? I mean, they are well fed on this journey. Bread in the morning, quail of a night. They are well looked after.
Unless you didn't like quail, of course.
Unless you didn't like, yeah, which is a strange thing. But I mean, and quail, of course, was a delicacy in Egypt. Which is he's feeding them not just enough food or average food. He's giving them good food to eat.
Well, we believe in a Father God who is generous. Jesus talks about a father who, if your son says, "Can I have some bread?" you wouldn't give him a stone, would you? Or a fish, you wouldn't give him a snake. So he wants to meet their needs. Although unfortunately, it will be in everyone's heart to eventually become disgruntled with whatever they have, whether it's a lot or a little. And sometimes in life it seems that those who have more become disgruntled more quickly than those who have less.
Yeah, I think so.
There is a bit later on in Numbers where they get bored of manna, isn't there, as well?
They do, yeah, and because they were eating it for quite a while. But verse 31 says it tasted like wafers made with honey.
The idea it was sweet and delicious, wasn't it? Yes.
Yeah, that sounds nice to me. And they're given then in verses 17 to 18 instruction on how much to collect. And it's described as an omer in the NIV. When I kind of researched this, no one's entirely sure what an omer is, but it's perhaps around about 2 liters worth of manna. And there's this strange thing, isn't it, about not collecting too little or too much. It feels like when I'm reading that, there's another miracle going on, that no matter how much people collected, it was neither too much or too little, which is a fantastic thing, isn't it? And then verse 19 and 20, there's this little interesting thing where some people kept it over. What do you make of that, John?
Well, there's a temptation in all of us to, as I say, whatever you have, you want more, don't you? And I wonder, my first thought was, say this was a Wednesday, did they want to have the Thursday in bed and not have to go out and collect the manna? But I'm not sure. I think it was. I think just they were uncertain that there would be enough for the next day. They just wanted to have a bit put by. In fact, you mentioned last week that you came to faith at Spring Harvest when you were in your early 20s. Strange enough, I came to faith as well at Spring Harvest in my early 30s, so I was a bit older than you. But it was after a period of my life when there'd been something I'd really wanted and it didn't work out. And yet this was a time in which, while I was in great confusion and I'd been a nominal church-going Christian, God was teaching me all the time about this. And then finally, in the weeks leading up to Easter, this sort of reading was very popular, Exodus, isn't it? And the thing that, as I say, goes back to this lady in the cell group, the thing she said was, if we try and take more from God than is our due, and we all try and do it, if we want more out of life than is our due, if it's not what God wants for us, then it will go rotten on us. I mean, Jesus himself says, "Store up for yourself in heaven, where it doesn't decay and doesn't go off."
Exactly.
None of that is an argument about anyone who is desperately in need. There's a need for social justice, but when it's clearly beyond God's purpose, when it's something we want rather than what God wants for us, then you need to be very careful. And then, of course, there's this lesson going on as well. They have many tests along the way. There's the whole story of the Ten Commandments, of various enemies they face on the way, and then finally the big decision when they get to the Promised Land about whether it's safe to invade or not. And they need to learn a lot of trust, which they are nowhere near making. If their trust was deeper, they would go more than a week or two before they forgot everything that happened.
That's right. And it seems to me that there's a kind of practical thing as well about God providing a very set amount of food, an omer of manna and a quail, or perhaps maybe more than one quail, per person. To do that walk across rugged terrain, probably carrying things, looking after kids and elderly people, that would have taken a lot of calories, you know, and for them to survive and get to the Promised Land ready to enter into the Promised Land and fight, they needed to be well fed.
Well, they needed to be in the fighting men at least needed to be in peak physical condition, and the children need to be well fed enough not to grow up small and malnourished, but to be the next generation of fighting men, didn't they? So yes, so they had, when it says they had enough for their need, it's not a miserly need, it's they had enough for what they really needed to stay healthy. And what it was delicious as well. So they didn't have an awful lot to complain about.
No, exactly. So should we move on to just thinking about what all this means for us? So we're going to spend a few moments just thinking about some of the application of this and go a little bit wider. Let's think a little bit about some of the application points. John, you talked on Sunday about 3 particular points. Do you want to just touch on them again? Where do you want to start with that? Okay,
well, since the end of the story was about being people who trust in God's purposes, trusting him enough to let him guide them to be part of his plans, it starts with not falling away from that trust. And so we need to remember, basically in all science, it's built on empirical experience, isn't it, of what's gone before. How do we remember all that God's done for us? What should we be remembering in our lives, what God's done for us? I can only say that it starts with, it's closely overlinked to thankfulness and gratitude as well. These things go together. And sometimes a little discipline I follow is when, if you're a bit down or a bit feeling not in the right place, sometimes just think of 10 things you can thank God for that day. That's often, once you get to 5 or 6, they start pouring out, and they might not be small things, but they're things that other people might not have had.
Exactly.
And on top of that, we're Christians. Do we remember the most important thing we should be thanking for, of course, is that God, through the end of his Old Testament purposes, brought Jesus into the world and made him known to us, and on top of that, has made him known to us individually in our lives as well.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of make a point every now and again of just kind of recounting the things that God has done for me, both in terms of like the big things, like, you know, the gift of Jesus, the gift of the Holy Spirit, but also in personal things about how God brought me to where I am. It just kind of centers me on what God has done rather than my circumstances. So I make a point of just recounting that. And I'm someone who has got a terrible memory, so kind of consciously, intentionally just recounting things keeps those things in my memory and helps.
It is, but if you're really low, I think you have to start at a more basic level. You probably thank God for the last cup of coffee that you were brought, and that you had someone to bring it you, and that it was. And I know you're very into that it's good coffee, and that it tasted, and you're drinking it in a warm room. You know, lots of people don't have these things around the world, and so you might have to start at a more basic level. If you're really overwhelmed by the pressures that you're under, and you can't see anything like that.
That's right. And yeah, when you were talking about that whole kind of them looking back, I mean, that is it's one of the huge dangers of church, that people look back to a kind of golden era of the church. And my kind of, when I've looked into some of these things, not just at Christ Church, but in other churches where I've been at, it's never quite as golden as people make out. So in my previous church, some of the older people could remember, so they said, the time when the church was full. And it was quite a big size building, a bit like Christ Church, and probably held at a maximum 400 people. So, of course, we have the records in church of Sunday attendances, and you can go back, and it was never full, ever, as far as I can tell. It was never full, but people remember it as being full in the golden time. And we can always look back and think, oh, so much better then. And we get stuck, I think, in a certain place. You know, we look back, whether it's, the worship was better then, the preaching was better then, or there's more people then, or we had more social life then. And quite often, it's never quite as golden as people make out.
Possibly, but just thinking there while you were saying that, everything you've been saying is external, isn't it? It's all the things you see around you. None of it is about where you were then and where you are now, and what your call to faithfulness and trust is in that place that you're in now. Whether it's in slavery in Egypt, but propped reasonably well fed to do the work, whether it's suffering in the desert, or whether you feel like you are showered in the promised land style of blessings.
Exactly. And I think, you know, the golden era often relates to when people felt closest to God. And that's got nothing to do with the preaching, the worship, the social life, or whatever. That has all to do with how you are internally in your relationship to God. And that's the kind of key thing. And that's the challenge for us to make this time the time, it's the golden era. And that, you know, it's the time when we think this was brilliant because of our relationship with God is so on point, it's so on fire that this becomes all consuming.
An interesting observation. So it's often as much about how we've developed or not developed spiritually as how the church around us has developed. Because there's that cliche, isn't there, on church notice boards? You know, if God seems far away, guess who's moved? Which I know at times can be appallingly insensitive, because you may be at that time of crisis where it's very hard to feel God's love for you at that particular point in time. But there is an element of truth in it as well, isn't there?
There is.
And yet the stories of Paul in jail, Richard, you know, I'm very inspired by Richard Wurmbrand's books. These are books that he might have been the only Christian in that place. He might have been away from his family nearly 10 years at one stage in jail under terrible conditions. Yet joy pours out of every page because he knows he's exactly, and Paul to be at that point.
Exactly, yeah. And maybe that's something what, you know, God's teaching the people of Israel here. You know, that their relationship with him is the most important thing, and that's what they need to hold on to. So that regardless of their circumstances, they are thriving in their faith. So what other points did you bring out, John, that we just need to touch on?
Right, so the second one's about encouragement of others. You know, I said how many people in that crowd would it have taken to, because we know what we've seen on the television recently in the States, but also here as well, how many people does it take to change the whole mood of a large group of people who under any other circumstance, most of them are perfectly decent, caring people. Doesn't take many, and we are, if we're to be salt in the earth, how many of us does it take to be out salt? And how important is it for us to remember that, because otherwise we will drag other people down with us, won't we?
Exactly. And you know, I think it's, you know, one of the things that we will try and do over Lent and encouraging people to be thankful is to tell others about what they're thankful for, you know, so that people are talking about, effectively they're talking about God's provision.
Well, they are, because it's only a small step from the church isn't where it was 20 years ago. The church is a mere flicker of what it was 20 or 30 years ago to, well, God's not what he was 30 years ago. And of course, that is actually blasphemous at the end of the day to feel that, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I don't think it takes that many people to be pillars of faith. And if you can't do it all the time, be a pillar of faith when it needs to be, so that when you're grumbling, somebody else will drag you out of that. For the whole community to move on in a positive way, the whole people of God, and the whole broader community as well, because I don't think Jesus ever saw the world divided into Christians and non-Christians, did he? He saw.
No. And you know, I think the one of the points that I kind of take out the whole story is just how wonderful God's provision is. And I've experienced in my own life the times when God has provided, and a lot of the time when God has kind of provided, it's been at a point where I've been both struggling in something, but also really seeking after God for something, because in terms of just trying to grow and develop in my Christian life. Because I think sometimes God provides stuff and we don't always see it.
No.
And you need to be in a certain place to be able to see what God's provided. Because I guess, certainly with the quail, because quail was quite it was a bird that kind of migrated across that area. The people of Israel could have just seen it as a coincidence, but they didn't. They did see it as a miracle because God said he would provide it, and he provided it daily. And so let's think about some questions for people to reflect on. And so let's go a little bit further. So we're going to give you some questions to think about now, either individually to reflect on or to discuss in your missional communities. And it is always good to discuss these questions wider because you get a broader perspective and get a sense of what God might be saying to you. So I'm going to go first. So my first question is this: after seeing all the miracles that God did, why do you think that people were so quick to grumble? Just kind of reflect on that and what was going on in them. Put yourself in their place and just try and work out, why did they forget all that God had done and then focus on their immediate circumstance? John, what questions would you like to ask?
Well, Rob mentioned last week that he was weaker at hearing from God than obeying it when he clearly heard, and I knew you felt differently. And of course, there's those of us who find it hard to hear from God, and then if we do hear from him, find it hard to obey him. But my question would be, how can we make sure that we're hearing from God on a daily basis and not just soaking up negative influences that allow us to be trapped in seeing our own problems?
Good question. Good question. Okay, and your next one?
Basically, then we've touched on this. What is it that we can thank God for? If we were asked now to give 10 things that we could thank God for, where would we start?
Good, yeah.
And try that at home and see how you feel at the end of that. I bet you feel close to God at the end of that than you did at the beginning.
Absolutely. So a couple of questions from me then. Are you looking back to the good old days of something, either church or your own spiritual walk with Jesus? Or are you confidently moving into God's purposes for you today? If it's the former, what are you going to do to kind of shift your thinking? And the last question, describe an area in which you are waiting for God's provision. And what does the story do to help you? So there's 5 questions. So John, what did you say?
That's a deep one there.
The deep one, it is. It's a deep one, yeah. Yeah, we always like to throw in something that will get people reflecting internally. John, it's been a delight to have you on this again. It's always good to have a conversation with you. So hopefully you'll join us on Sunday and join us again next Tuesday for another edition of Deeper. Until then, stay safe and goodbye.